I used to believe that trust ended loudly, with accusations and raised voices, but mine began to fail in silence. That evening, I arrived home earlier than usual and found the apartment already lit. She sat on the sofa with her legs folded beneath her, reading something on her phone. The television was on, though the sound was low, almost absent. It felt as though the room had been prepared for someone else and had not yet adjusted to my presence. "You're early," she said, glancing up. "I finished sooner than I expected," I replied. I set my keys down carefully, listening to the small, deliberate sound they made against the table. "Everything okay?" "Yes, of course." She smiled, brief and polite, the kind of smile one gave without thinking. I told myself I was imagining things. We had been together long enough to allow for quiet days, for moments when conversation felt unnecessary. Still, something about her attention unsettled me. Her phone never left her hand. When I sat beside her, she shifted slightly, just enough to create space. I asked about her day. She answered in general terms. Work was busy, the weather unpleasant, nothing worth mentioning. I nodded and filled the gaps with my own routine, hearing how ordinary my voice sounded. I wondered when we had started speaking this way, like people careful not to overstep. Later, while we prepared dinner, she stood at the counter and typed a message, shielding the screen with her body. The movement was subtle, almost unconscious. I looked away immediately, embarrassed by the impulse to watch. That night, as we lay in bed, her back turned toward me, I felt an unfamiliar weight settle in my chest. It was not suspicion yet. It was only the sense that something essential had shifted, and that I had been the last to notice. In the days that followed, I paid closer attention to the small details I had once overlooked. It was not that I searched for evidence. I told myself I was only trying to understand what had changed. We met for lunch one afternoon near her office. She arrived 10 minutes late, apologizing without explanation. Her coat still unbuttoned, as if she had left in a hurry. As we sat down, she placed her phone face down on the table. I noticed the gesture immediately and then felt foolish for noticing it at all. "You seem distracted," I said, keeping my tone light. "Just tired," she answered. "It's been a long week." I accepted that answer, though it did not settle me. While I spoke, she nodded at the right moments, but her attention drifted elsewhere. Her gaze moved toward the window, then to the door, as if she were expecting someone. When her phone vibrated, she reached for it too quickly, then stopped herself. "Sorry," she said. "Work." I smiled and said nothing. I remembered a time when she used to tell me everything without being asked. Now I felt as though I were interrupting something private simply by being there. That evening, I asked if she wanted to watch a film together. She hesitated before agreeing, and during the film she checked her phone several times, excusing herself once to take a call in the other room. I listened to the low sound of her voice through the door, unable to make out the words, only the tone, careful, almost gentle. When she returned, she avoided my eyes and focused on the screen. I considered asking who had called, then decided against it. I told myself that trust meant restraint, that love required space. Yet as I lay awake later, I wondered whether I was confusing patience with avoidance. I began to feel a quiet unease, not sharp enough to confront, but persistent enough to follow me into sleep. The unease grew in ways I could not easily name. I noticed it in the little things. The way she laughed at my jokes a moment too late, the way she seemed to rehearse her responses before speaking, even when we were alone. I wanted to ask, to break the distance with words, but I could not find the right ones. Every question felt like it might push us further apart instead of closer. One evening, I came home to find her sitting at the table with a notebook open in front of her. She looked up and smiled, but there was something different in her eyes, hesitation, a shadow I had never seen before. "Working on something?" I asked. "Just writing," she said, closing it quickly. "Nothing important." I nodded, even though the tone of her voice made me wonder whether she had lied. I left it there, told myself I was imagining it. Later, in the living room, I noticed her phone buzzing repeatedly on the counter. She picked it up, glanced at it, then put it back face down, her hand lingering longer than necessary. I felt a small, creeping panic in my chest. Not sharp, but unmistakable. I wanted to ask who it was, but the words stuck in my throat. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I realized that I had begun counting the minutes between her touches, the seconds between her words. I remembered how it had felt before, how easy it had been to reach her, to trust her. And now I could not tell whether the gap between us was something I had imagined or something real. Sleep came unevenly. I woke at intervals, listening to her breathing and the quiet hum of the apartment. Every sound felt charged with a meaning I could not fully understand, and every pause seemed deliberate. I could not tell if I was losing her or if I had already lost her and only refused to admit it. A week later, I found myself lingering at the edge of her world in ways I had never done before. I noticed the way her phone lit up across the room, the way her eyes darted toward it, and I felt that same small, tightening knot in my chest. I wanted to ask what was happening, but I feared the answer more than the silence. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than usual again. The apartment smelled faintly of something sweet, perfume, or maybe a candle, but it wasn't the scent I remembered from before. She was on the balcony, leaning against the railing, her posture casual but distant. "You're home early," she said without turning. "I finished work early," I replied. I hesitated, then asked, "Was someone with you?" She laughed softly, almost nervously. "No." "Why?" "Just the smell," I said, even though it sounded ridiculous. She shrugged, her attention fixed on the street below. "Could be the neighbors," she said, and I wanted to press further, but I didn't. I knew better. That evening, I noticed she avoided sharing small things that used to be routine: what she had eaten, who she had spoken to at work, the errands she ran. The details that once made up the texture of our days were slipping through my fingers, leaving only her half-smiles and vague answers. I began to question myself. Maybe I was imagining the distance, exaggerating normal habits. Maybe I was just tired, too sensitive, too insecure. But when I caught her glancing at her phone with that quick, careful movement, I could not convince myself that I was wrong. I lay awake again that night, counting the pauses in her breathing, noticing how her back was slightly turned to me. The apartment felt colder than it had before, though the heater hummed steadily. I realized that even if nothing had happened, even if I was only imagining betrayal, the trust between us had already fractured in ways I could not repair. It happened gradually, but there was a moment when I knew things could never return to the way they had been. I came home one Thursday evening to find her sitting at the kitchen table, phone in hand, her expression unreadable. She didn't look up when I walked in, and for a second I felt like a stranger in my own apartment. "Hey," I said quietly, placing my bag down. She gave a small nod, not a smile. "Hey." I wanted to ask something, anything, to break the distance, but the words died before they reached my lips. Instead, I made dinner in silence, listening to the faint sound of her typing. I told myself not to read into it, not to imagine things that might not exist, but I couldn't stop. After dinner, I suggested we go for a walk. The air was cold, and the streets were nearly empty. We walked side by side, but our steps never matched, as if we were each tracing a different rhythm. "I feel like we're not talking as much lately," I said carefully. She glanced at me then, a flicker of something passing across her face. Guilt, maybe, or annoyance. "I've been busy," she said, soft but firm. "I know," I replied, "but it's not just that." She didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough that I considered turning back, saying nothing more, pretending that everything was fine. But I couldn't. "Are you happy?" I asked finally, my voice lower than I intended. Her eyes dropped to the pavement. "I don't know," she said after a pause. Her words were brief, almost casual, but they struck me with the weight of certainty. I wanted to argue, to plead, to convince her that we could fix it, but instead I only felt the cold wind against my face and the emptiness of the space between us. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours. I realized that even if she stayed beside me, a part of her mind was elsewhere. I could feel it in every gesture, every pause, every carefully measured word. And for the first time, I understood that trust, once broken, lingered like a quiet wound that refused to heal. The days after that walk were filled with a quiet tension I could not name aloud. We spoke, of course, we always did, but our conversations felt measured, careful, like we were both aware of fragile glass between us. I noticed the smallest shifts. The way she picked up her phone just before I entered the room, the way she laughed too quickly at messages I couldn't see, the way she sometimes hesitated before answering even trivial questions. One evening, I tried to confront it gently. We were sitting in the living room, the soft hum of the heater filling the silence. "I feel like something has changed," I said, my voice low. She looked at me then, her eyes hesitant. "Change happens," she said. "Doesn't mean it's bad." I wanted to press, to insist, to ask why I felt the distance so sharply. But she had already retreated behind her calm tone, and I realized that asking might only widen the gap. So I stayed quiet, even though my chest felt tight. Later, I found myself going over old memories. The way we had laughed without restraint, the ease of our conversations, the comfort of a touch that required no thought. I could see now how gradual the drift had been, how subtle the moments that had led here. One night, I noticed her phone buzzing on the counter. She glanced at it quickly, then picked it up with a careful casualness. I froze, aware that I was watching, aware that I had no right to, but unable to stop myself. Her fingers moved fast, precise, almost secretive. She put it down again, but her expression had shifted, an almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes, a soft bite of her lip. I told myself not to imagine things, not to create evidence out of intuition. But when I lay in bed that night, listening to her steady breathing, I realized that even if nothing had happened, I had already begun to lose her in my mind. The trust one had taken for granted was eroding quietly, leaving only a hollow space where certainty had once lived. It was on a Saturday afternoon that I first caught a glimpse of what I could no longer ignore. I had planned to surprise her with lunch, picking up sandwiches from the little shop she liked. When I opened the door, the apartment smelled faintly of something floral, the kind of scent that didn't belong to her. She was on the balcony, her posture relaxed but deliberate, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, almost careful, and though I could not hear the words, the tone was intimate in a way that made my stomach tighten. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should announce myself. She didn't notice me at first, and then when she did, she lowered her eyes quickly, as if caught in a private moment she didn't want to share. "I brought lunch," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. She looked up, startled, then forced a smile. "Oh, thank you." She ended the call quickly, but the change in her expression lingered. There was a tension in her shoulders, a careful posture that hadn't been there before. We ate in silence. I watched her take small bites, noticing the way her eyes kept flicking toward the counter, toward her phone, toward some invisible point I could not see. I wanted to ask who she had been speaking to, why she had sounded different, but I felt a sudden, heavy sense of futility. The moment to ask had passed before I could even find the words. Later, she suggested we watch a film. I agreed, though I could barely focus on the screen. My mind replayed the sound of her voice on the phone, the subtle shift in her expression, the way she avoided looking at me directly. When she finally fell asleep that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of a truth I could not yet name. Something had changed irreversibly, and though I did not know all the details, I felt the fracture in every quiet moment between us. I realized that even if she stayed beside me physically, a part of her had already begun to drift away. By the following week, the distance between us was no longer subtle. It had settled into the rhythm of our days, quiet but insistent. I could sense it in the way she moved around the apartment, careful not to brush against me, careful not to leave herself exposed in the ordinary intimacy we once shared. One evening, I tried again, gently, cautiously, to reach her. We were sitting at the kitchen table, her notebook open in front of her, pen poised. "I feel like we're drifting," I said. She looked up, her expression guarded. "I don't think we are," she replied. Her voice was calm, neutral, but there was a hesitation I could not ignore. "I don't know," I said. I feel like there's something you're not telling me." She closed the notebook and leaned back. "I'm not hiding anything," she said. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the way she avoided my gaze, the small movements that spoke of self-consciousness, told a different story. I stayed quiet, forcing myself to nod, though my mind raced with questions I could not ask without pushing her further away. Later that night, I checked the apartment quietly, noticing the faint traces of another presence. A scent, a misplaced cup, a chair slightly out of place. I told myself it could be nothing, that I was letting suspicion turn small details into evidence. But even as I reasoned with myself, I could feel the slow, persistent ache of doubt taking root. I began to realize that the betrayal might not come in a single, dramatic moment. It might already be happening quietly, in the spaces where I could not reach her, in the silences and guarded gestures. And the thought of that, of loving someone who could be elsewhere, emotionally or otherwise, was more painful than any confrontation could ever be. It all came to a quiet breaking point one evening. I had returned home later than usual, expecting the usual calm, the soft hum of the apartment. But when I walked in, I found her sitting on the sofa, her posture stiff, phone in hand, her eyes avoiding mine. We need to talk," I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to me. She didn't respond at first. When she finally looked up, her eyes were guarded, tired, and I recognized the distance there. The same distance I had been noticing for weeks, now undeniable. "I know," she said softly, almost too gently. "Know what?" My hands were clenching the strap of my bag without my realizing it. "That you feel it. That you've noticed," she said. Her voice was careful, deliberate, almost rehearsed. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop it." The words landed with a weight I had been bracing for but still could not fully comprehend. I sat down slowly, trying to steady my breathing, trying to absorb the truth without letting it shatter me entirely. She explained, in measured, hesitant words, things I had feared and suspected but could not have known for certain. I listened, feeling the floor beneath me shift in ways I could not repair. There was guilt in her voice, yes, but also a defensiveness that made it clear she had been protecting herself as much as she had been hiding anything. When she finished, the apartment felt smaller, colder. I wanted to cry, to scream, to demand more, but instead I only sat there, silent, trying to reconcile the person I loved with the choices she had made. I realized that the trust one had taken for granted was gone, and no apology, no explanation, could restore it fully. That night, I lay awake listening to the empty spaces between us, hearing the echo of a love that was still there, but altered, irreversibly. I understood then that betrayal was not only about the act, it was about the quiet erosion of intimacy, the slow fracture of certainty, and the way it changed everything that came after. In the weeks that followed, we remained together in a physical sense, but the closeness we had once shared was gone. I learned to navigate the apartment carefully, avoiding questions I could not bear the answers to, and she moved around with a polite distance, as if we were learning to coexist rather than love. I spent hours replaying moments in my mind. Small gestures, casual phrases, the way her attention had shifted, and I realized how long I had ignored the signs. Guilt, anger, and sorrow mingled, creating a quiet ache that no conversation could soothe. I understood that trust, once broken, does not simply return. It leaves a mark, subtle but permanent, shaping every choice, every word, every glance. We tried, in our own way, to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. Meals together, short walks, shared chores. Yet every touch carried a caution, every smile a question. I found myself holding back, afraid to expose the rawness inside me, afraid that any moment of openness might break what little remained. One night, as I lay beside her, I reached out instinctively and she did not respond. Her hand rested just beyond mine, neither closing the gap nor moving further away. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the shadows cast by the streetlight outside, and I realized that love could survive in fragments, but it would never be whole in the way it had once been. I drifted into sleep with that thought lingering, a quiet acknowledgement that some losses are not loud or dramatic. They are measured in the spaces between words, in the subtle shifts of attention, in the slow erosion of certainty. And when I woke the next morning, I carried that knowledge with me like a shadow, a permanent reminder of what had been and what could no longer return. So that's the end of our story. Thanks for listening. Subscribe and stay tuned.